Hey y'all, welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babbick, your guide through all the disasters history has to offer.
And I'm Ari Babbick, here to remind Katie that they say everything's bigger in Texas, including the catastrophes.
That's right. Today we're saddling up and heading to the Lone Star State, where the disasters are as massive as the state itself.
We're talking about the Texas City disaster, an explosion so powerful it rocked the entire Gulf Coast, and a few other Texas-sized calamities that left their mark.
So dust off your boots and join us as we explore a place where even the disasters go big or go home.
They say, don't mess with Texas, but sometimes disasters don't get the memo.
Welcome back, y'all. I hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas if you celebrate, and if you don't, whatever holidays you do celebrate, I hope they were great.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Today, we're going to be going back to Texas.
Texas talk.
I love Texas. Texas is one of my favorite states to travel through because all of the hotels with breakfasts have those Belgian waffle, Texas-shaped waffle makers.
Oh, yeah.
It makes me so happy every time we visit. And I know there's so much more to Texas than that, but that's probably my favorite part.
I think my favorite part was when we were traveling cross country and we had made it through Texas into Louisiana. And someone at a gas station said to David that, welcome to the greatest state in the Union. And I said, no, Texas is better. It has cowboy hats.
That's right. Oh, that sweet child was very enthusiastic about Texas after that trip.
Absolutely.
They did get a cowboy hat, so worked out for him pretty well. For drinks tonight, I had trouble picking one. So I made the mistake or awesome choice, depending on how you look at it, of asking ChatGPT.
Drinks by ChatGPT.
Well, I thought ChatGPT...
AI is taking over everything.
I thought they were going to give me like a recommendation for an already made cocktail, but ChatGPT gave me a recipe. So this is literally cocktails by AI.
I love it.
This is what it wrote. When I asked, I want to do a themed cocktail on the Texas City disaster. Can you help me pick one? They sent back the Exploding Sunrise.
Oh, wow. Okay.
A nod to the 1947 Texas City disaster where a ship loaded with ammonium nitrate caused a devastating explosion. 1 ounce of rum, quote, for the fire. 1 ounce of orange liqueur, quote, for the sunrise. 2 ounces of pineapple juice, a tropical twist. Splash of grenadine because everything went red. And ginger beer to mimic the Gulf waves.
Wow.
It even put emojis in.
Thank you, ChatGPT.
And it's delicious.
It is delicious.
I may be letting ChatGPT choose our cocktails more often at this point because clearly ChatGPT knows me far too well. It's a bit of a problem. But yeah, that's our drink tonight. We're going over the Texas City disaster, and I'm excited about it. This is a big one, so I'm going to just get rolled right into it.
Let's do it.
The quote this week is, everything's bigger in Texas.
Of course.
I don't think there was another one that would have worked nearly as well. So everything's bigger in Texas.
Including me. When I go to Texas, I get bigger. What? Everything's bigger in Texas?
Sure. Yep, that's right. So
Sorry, no.
This disaster took place in 1947, which was 2 years after World War II. And it happened in Texas City. Texas City, we've never been to it, but if you can picture where Houston is, Texas City is just south of Houston, and then just south of that is Galveston, Texas. So it's on the Galveston Bay, it's a port town, and it's right in there with Houston and Galveston.
Mm-hmm.
Texas City is very industrialized. One of the quotes describing it called it an ominous Oz.
Wow.
Which is pretty fitting when you look at the pictures. The skyline is just studded with those big chimney stacks from factories and oil refineries. There's tons of oil tanks all through the town.
Yeah.
The dock is very industrialized with just those big warehouses. And then in 1947, the city was really kind of split into 3 sections. There was 2 on the waterfront. One of them was the real factory and chemical factory area, which again, that's all that industrialized factories, warehouses, docks, all that kind of stuff. And on the other part of the waterfront was the poor part of the city, which was, this is 1947, pretty segregated. There was an area for blacks that was called the bottom, and there was an area that was primarily Mexicans, and that was called the barrio. And then there was the upper part of town, which is where the white people lived.
Mm.
So segregation is alive and well. The KKK was alive and well in this area of Texas. There was a lot of poor people in this particular town because industrialized, factory work and all that kind of stuff is often taken by the poor. Another quote about the city is it was hammered into existence with no regards for aesthetics.
Ooh.
The city had very few amenities. There weren't a lot of parks. There weren't a lot of theaters. There wasn't a lot for people to do. It was actually so crowded that the school was split into 2 sections. There were so many children, they couldn't all go to school at the same time.
Oh, wow.
So half of them went in the morning and half of them went at night because there wasn't even enough schools for the kids. Like, there just wasn't a lot of amenities for the citizens. And a big part of that is because most of the factories there didn't pay taxes to the city. So the city didn't make a lot of money.
Okay.
The town really started to grow and develop in the late 1800s, it was bought by 2 duck hunters from the Midwest, like really rich duck hunters that I guess wanted to turn it into like a really
so
lucrative city. Duck hunters. I needed to
Rich
say that
duck
because it's
hunters.
such an odd thing to say. They headed up the Texas City Terminal Company and the Mainland Company, and those were specifically there to kind of run Texas City and get all of these factories in and start making money. They had a dream of building it up to be just a big industrialized town, industrialized port. More money. Most of the people who lived in the city recognized that even though there was 2 main companies overseeing it, it's really the same people. So the elite of the town are generally just referred to as the company. And I'm going to do that throughout this episode too.
Okay.
The company is just the elites who own most of the town at this point. During World War II, Texas City was a vital and really heavily guarded defense industry town. They produced a lot of things for the war. The largest tin smelter in the entire world was there, and it produced enough tin during the war to supply every single Allied country with all of the tin they needed on its own.
Damn.
Not that they were the only ones providing tin, but they made so much of it that they could have provided all the needs for the entire war. When the war ended, the town never ended up slowing down, really at all. It immediately turned its attention to the Cold War because there's money being made there. The government immediately turned its attention to the Cold War, and the city never slowed down. There was no post-war break. They just kept going. In the 7 years before 1947, 145 new chemical plants had been built along the Texas coast, and there was $1.5 billion being invested at that moment to build more. To give an idea of how messed up priorities were in a number of levels in this area, in 1943, during the war, there was a number of U-boats that were in the Gulf of Mexico.
No, really?
They sank 56 merchant ships during the war, but it was not well publicized. Not a lot of people knew about it. They were there, though, and they were fucking shit up.
Damn.
A hurricane stirred up in 1943, and the government decided that it was classified information. Yeah, the government considered the hurricane a military secret, so they gave no warning to anyone on the coasts that there was a hurricane coming because they didn't want to warn the U-boats. They were hoping the U-boats would have problems. So a whole ass hurricane hit Texas City and a large portion of the coast of Texas with absolutely no warning. It's known now as the surprise hurricane, caused 19 fatalities. Yeah, a lot of this story is on how the government didn't treat people well, so...
Go figure.
This was already going on. It was already pretty bad. A few days before the disaster, Texas City had actually voted to annex most of the factories that were in the town to essentially force them to start paying taxes, which doesn't have a ton to do with the story, but is interesting that they were moving in a good direction. The mayor at the time was also pretty radical in his beliefs. He wanted to take a lot of that tax money and reinvest it specifically into the poorer neighborhoods, so the Black and Mexican neighborhoods. He wanted to build them a hospital. He wanted to do more for those areas.
Actually take care of people?
But in 1947, it's worth mentioning that that's a pretty radical take.
Absolutely.
Especially in Texas in 1947. Pretty cool. And he got it done. He annexed these factories. It didn't end up doing him much good, but he did annex them a few days before. Now, 1947 was right in the middle of what's called the chemistry revolution.
Okay.
This is when scientists really started producing and, I don't want to say inventing, but discovering all kinds of different ways to use chemicals and all kinds of different things that chemicals can do. A lot of them were helpful, a lot of them were hurtful, but they were all related under the chemistry umbrella. This includes things like the Manhattan Project, building nuclear weapons. That would be part of the chemistry revolution. This is also when insecticides really started coming out. Dorothy Hodgkin solved the penicillin mystery, and penicillin started being put out on the market, saving millions of lives. Yeah. This is also the time when Willard Libby perfected carbon-14 dating, which was really a breakthrough. It allows us to date things, like how old dinosaur bones are, how old this archaeological site is, like big deal for us understanding the world around us. Grand Rapids introduced the miracle element of fluoride in its drinking water, the first time it was introduced in the United States. Yep. Earl Tupper was off designing seemingly indestructible bowls that he wanted to call Tupperware. This is when they started enriching breads with items from labs that would help with people's health. Asbestos was considered a miracle chemical as well. It was non-flammable, easy to use, nearly indestructible, so it was coating a number of buildings.
And people's lungs.
And one of the biggest ones, the one that is most important to our story today, ammonium nitrate, was getting bigger and bigger. It was starting to be used to enrich fields, to double, triple, and even quadruple yields, making things grow where they never had before. Ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is kind of the Jekyll and Hyde of compounds.
Okay.
On the one hand, it can be the mild-mannered Dr. Jekyll. When you mix it in soil, it can really help with boosting yields from crops. Your soil is so much richer when you add fertilizer to it, and ammonium nitrate is the number one thing that they use in fertilizer, but it's also a very explosive chemical. You probably remember things like the 93 World Trade Center bombing.
Oh, yeah.
That was ammonium nitrate, the Oklahoma City bombing. So was the Oklahoma City bombing. And that's the Mr. Hyde aspect of this. Throughout the course of World War II, we were producing thousands upon thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate to blow shit up. And when the war ended, we turned around and we started producing, or continued producing, thousands and thousands of pounds to use it in the soil. One was Mr. Hyde and the other one was Dr. Jekyll. Ammonium nitrate. On its own, it's just this odorless, colorless, kind of white crystal salt that's produced by a reaction of ammonia and nitric acid together. In order for it to get to the point that it is extremely dangerous, there are a few conditions that need to be met. On its own, it's not necessarily that bad, especially in small quantities. You require a large amount of ammonium nitrate for it to be able to explode in the first place. Once ammonium nitrate starts getting warm, starts getting hot, that's where we really start having problems. And that doesn't necessarily mean it being lit on fire. Ammonium nitrate does something called oxidizing, where it releases oxygen into the air, and that can start heating things up and can start a process where that heat builds and builds and builds. Once it reaches 210 degrees Celsius, that's when it begins to melt and releases even more gases, and it speeds the entire process up until eventually it gets hot enough and enough can't escape that it explodes. Ammonium nitrate getting wet helps accelerate this process because it turns it into, it starts as like little salt pieces, but almost like when you put water into cement, it hardens everything together, and that hardening makes these chemical reactions happen faster and faster. Once the ammonium nitrate explodes, it also creates a shock wave going through at the speed of sound. Because it is such a big explosion. Those shock waves on their own can break windows, break bones, flip cars, flip ships. They're biblical. Biblical. At this time, it was known that ammonium nitrate was dangerous, kind of. There were a number of ports that refused to ship ammonium nitrate out of them, Houston being one of them. But even though the government was producing tons and tons of this, none of its shipments were marked as dangerous. There was no guidelines or regulations on how to handle it, because if you handle ammonium nitrate safely, it's pretty darn safe. It's when you don't handle it well that it becomes dangerous. And there was no guidelines on how to handle it. There was no rules on what you should do. There wasn't even a warning label on these bags and bags and bags of nitrate that were being shipped in massive quantities throughout the country.
Yeah, super safe.
Super safe. Texas City took its first loads of ammonium nitrate in January 1946, and since then, 75,000 tons had passed through between then and 1947.
That's a lot.
This was also the beginning of the era of wondering, who was a communist? Are you a communist? Is your neighbor a communist?
Oh, yeah. Blacklists.
This is how ammonium nitrate was shifted in its use by the government. The government wanted to coax most of Europe away from joining communism. They didn't want people to follow the Soviet Union, but Europe was starving. Europe was broke. Europe had a lot of problems.
Yeah.
It was decided that they either needed to send bullets over for them to fight communism that way, or they needed to send bread over. Because if you make the populace happy, they're not going to turn to communism.
Right.
and they decided to do bread. And by that, they shipped a ton of fertilizer to Europe to keep them fed, for them to be able to grow more food and become more self-sufficient. And in that way, they're less likely to turn to communism.
Probably a better plan than the bullets.
Yep. This disaster involves a ship called the SS Grand Camp. The SS Grand Camp pulled into Texas City, Texas on April 14th, 1947, and began getting loaded with all of its various supplies. The SS Grand Camp was captained by Captain John D. Gilbon. It was a 7,176-ton freighter, 441 feet long. It cruised at 11 knots. Some of the stuff I found really cool about these kinds of ships is the SS Grand Camp was built in 70 days in 1942 with prefabbed parts. This was not unusual during World War II.
That's pretty impressive.
During the war, a number of freighters were built fast and dirty. They weren't pretty, but they were very effective. They had all of the pieces pre-made and would be shipped to various ports, and they'd put these ships together as quickly as possible. FDR called them ugly ducklings, but the nicer name was Liberty ships. There was 2,751 of these freighters built in 18 yards across the from coast to coast. One of the Liberty ships, though, the Robert E. Peary, was built in 4.5 days. Start to finish.
That's crazy.
It's wild when you look at the war effort during World War II, how much the United States was really able to put into action so quickly.
That's crazy.
And this is just one really, I think, cool example. This story, the SS Grand Camp, was originally launched under the name Curtis after the Supreme Court Justice Benjamin R. Curtis. These ships are really kind of like blue-collar Ford trucks of the ocean. They're not speedy, they're not flashy, but you can fit a lot in them and they can get the job done. After the war, the Grand Camp was mothballed in Philadelphia until a year later she was made available to European allies, France specifically, for the same reason that they were shipping ammonium nitrate over. They needed to get the ammonium nitrate from point A to point B, so they would give these European countries the Liberty ships for them to be able to ship enough of the nitrate back and forth.
Makes sense.
Generated goodwill, all that kind of stuff. At that point, its name was changed to the SS Grand Camp. Here we are, April 14th. The SS Grand Camp is docked in Texas City, Texas, with loading beginning. The ship should have already been loaded at this point, but foul weather had really caused a number of delays. She was on Pier O, and the ship was already pretty massively loaded down at this point. She had 59 barrels of twine from Cuba, 9,334 bags of shelled peanuts from Houston, 380 bales of cotton, a number of different pieces of oil well equipment, and over 900 crates of small arms ammunition.
It's just carrying everything.
These ships would hit multiple countries.
Yeah.
So she was loading up and was about to go around and unload, though the ammunition actually should have been unloaded in Venezuela and wasn't for whatever reason. There's not a lot of information on why, but it was just kind of still there. Longshoremen raced to load 5 million pounds of ammonium nitrate at Pier O, 51,502 bags from the Midwestern military plants, brought here by the railroad, and again with no warnings on them, and the number 2 and number 4 hold. This time, ammonium nitrate was packaged in these like 100-pound paper bags, very similar to what cement or play sand is packaged in today.
Oh, makes it extra safe.
Very, very safe. Yep.
He said sarcastically.
They all said sarcastically. As they were loading, most of the longshoremen noticed that a number of the bags felt really unnaturally warm. Workers were pressing their very cold hands down on the heated stacks. Some even laid down on top of them just to kind of feel the warmth sink into their body and take a break during the day.
Little do they know what they're lying on.
Some of the bags were scorching hot, too hot for them to even touch. And the humidity that day was nearly 100%.
So did no one question why these bags were hot?
Their assumption was it's because they had been on the railroad up until that morning and that it was hot because the railroad had been moving so fast, and inside those rail cars it can get pretty hot. So they assumed they were still heated from the railroad. And no, they didn't question it much more than that. There was no warning. They did not know that this could explode. They didn't know how bad it could be. I'm sure there was some questions and some thoughts about it, but it's not like this was a big box marked explosives that was warm. This was something they moved every day, pretty much, and had never had an issue with. And there was nothing out there to tell them that this was a really dangerous project. A lot of people at
Fair
that
enough.
time didn't even realize it was the same product that was used in bombs.
That makes sense.
Yeah. By August 16th, 1947, the vast majority of the ammonium nitrate had been loaded. The ship was planning on leaving harbor that evening. The grain camp was sunk low in raspberry oil slick-hued water because all of the water around Texas City was disgusting with oil and chaos in it because it's a Texas industrial town in the 1940s.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of regulations not to dump
regulation.
it, and there was a lot of oil and a lot of things that float on water. On August 16th, 1947, by 8:12 in the morning, there were small rolls of green and orange smoke rolling out from inside of the Grand Camp ship.
Well, that's not good.
By 8:15, they were rolling over the waterfront. The crew on the ship at that time talked about how small fires were starting to pop up in hold number 4. There'd be like a little candle-sized flame on the ammonium nitrate, and they'd pour water on it, and it would go out. And then a few feet over,
Or water on it.
a little bit bigger. So the thing with water and ammonium nitrate is water can put out the fires. You just don't want it to sit in damp conditions where it hardens and gets worse and worse and worse.
Right.
But pouring a little bit of water on it to put out a fire is not a bad thing. The crew talked about how they had to try and move bags out of the way because fires were starting inside of these highly stacked bags. They were stacked like 7 high and 6 deep. So they had to pull out multiple bags to get to the fires that were starting inside of them. By 8:15, the volunteer fire department is informed that there's a fire that seems to be getting bigger and bigger at Pier O. Henry Baumgartner was the head of the department, and he came over immediately. Of course, the city had no fireboat. They couldn't afford it, and they had sold it a few months earlier.
Yep.
At 8:20, the captain of the ship decides to sound the emergency whistle, and crews are pulled out of hold number 4, so they're no longer trying to put out these fires as they start. They're out on top of the deck. Diggy 1 orders the hatch sealed and to open all of the valves to flood hold number 4 with steam. And the reason they wanted to do that is if you flood the hold with just water, yes, that's going to put the fire out really quickly and really easily, but it'll also destroy the cargo. This sounds like a poor decision, but it makes sense at the time. You want to try the least invasive thing first. And at this point, they didn't know how bad it could be.
Right.
So flood it with steam, put out the fire that way. This, of course, made the situation worse. This is a city without a lot of entertainment, without a lot of amenities. It was pretty common for townsfolk to come down and watch whatever's going on at the dock, especially when there's fires. It's a dock in the 1940s. There's fires pretty often on docks. And people would watch as there was only a volunteer fire department. There was no official fire department. They'd watch as they came and put down the fires. And everyone would just kind of come and hang out on the dock right next to the street to see what was going on. So there was tons of people gathering in the street pretty quickly by 8:20 in the morning at this point. I mentioned before that the schools were split into 2 sections, one that ended at 12 and one that started at 12. Okay. So half the city's kids were showing up because they weren't in school yet.
Oh, of course.
There was cars stopped to watch, folks gathering from all around the city, and really now people starting to come in to watch this strange smoke. This was extra exciting. When an oil drum got hit with lightning, that was pretty exciting when the fire would shoot up in the air. But now they've got this orange, purple, and like greenish smoke, depending on which witness you're listening to. But it definitely was fancy colored smoke because it's a chemical fire.
Yep.
So it's not something they were used to. It's not something they had seen before. At 8:30, tugboats are called by Mike Makisa, and he was the leader of the company. He kind of ran the industrial area at that point. He called Galveston to try and get tugboats over to tug the grain camp out into water.
Right. That would have been a fair plan.
Yep. He was outside with a man named Sandberg, who was his assistant, and Sandberg recalled, "We stood around and discussed things in general. We were not too concerned about a fire on board a ship. We probably talked about more things that had no connection with the vessel. Fire concerned us least of all." So no one's worried yet. No one's concerned. This is a dock fire. We're not freaking out yet. The chief volunteer firefighters also sounded the general alarm at this point at the dockside siren, so called all the volunteer fire workers to come in. Baumgartner at this point is trying to run a 50-foot line of fire hose from the pumps inside of Warehouse O because they can't use the bay water. They don't know what chemicals are on it.
Right.
They really can't easily use that to put out fires. They have to go to these underwater reservoirs, and the closest one was 50 feet away in Warehouse Zero.
Because otherwise you're just putting oil on fire.
Yep. At 8:40, crews are called off the ship. Everyone except for the volunteer fire department is not allowed on the ship. By 8:45, the waters around the Grand Camp started to churn and boil because the hold was getting so hot.
That's not
So
good.
the water's literally boiling around the bottom of the ship. The deck is now covered in firefighters. There's a crew of 12 firefighters trying to get things going there, but they couldn't hear each other over the sounds coming from inside of the ship. The deck was starting to swell, shrink, swell, shrink. The smoke was rolling and swelling across the entire 50-foot deck. At this point, though, the city's one and only fire truck arrived.
Hooray!
That's a start. The volunteer fire crew is here now, the vast majority of them. 11 of them, plus the chief, are on the ship, trying to deal with it there. The rest of them are on the dock, trying to spray water onto the ship, but spraying either from the fire truck or the hose that they had ran from the warehouse wasn't working at all. And the reason why is the air was so hot around the SS Grand Camp that as soon as the water struck it, it would turn into steam.
Oh my God.
So there were 27 volunteer firefighters at the dock at this point.
Mm-hmm.
The entire city had 28. One of them was homesick. At 9 o'clock, Walter Sandberg goes into the office to check on those tugboats that had been ordered, and the ship begins to really bend and arc, with nails starting to pop out.
Huh.
There is a cloth tarp over the hatch of hold number 4, and that tarp starts to push up and up and up into a giant mound. By 9:01, the tarp catches on fire and snaps off and flies away like a paper bag. The hatch buckles and flies off shortly after that. And at that point, once the hatch blew off, the chief didn't take his firefighters off. They took their hoses and started spraying directly into the hold.
I thought the ship was going to explode from pressure.
9:12.
But it's going to get worse, isn't it?
At 9:12, the SS Grand Camp explodes dramatically. The entire thing just disintegrates and gets sent into a giant fireball in the air, and pieces of it flying and dropping all over town and the Bay of Galveston. 4 miles away from the disaster, a public bust was lifted entirely off of the ground and slammed back down.
Oh, damn.
10 miles away in Galveston, people are thrown to their knees. 25 miles away in Freeport, a number of glass windows pop out and are destroyed.
Damn.
40 miles away, windows in businesses and homes are also exploding. 150 miles away in Palestine, Texas, residents hear a boom and feel the ground moving enough to knock them over. 400 miles away in Louisiana, geologists felt and heard tremors going through. And 900 miles away at a seismology station in Denver, Colorado, they detected the boom. The seismology office in Denver thought it was a nuclear bomb.
Wow.
These bombs, or these explosions, they set off mushroom clouds. They act very similar to a nuclear bomb. They just don't have radiation. But in terms of the destruction and the blast that happens, it is very similar to a nuclear bomb.
Oh, shit.
There were 14 million pounds of ship sent in chunks across the area. The deck landed a half-mile away. A piece of the bow landed inside the Monsanto plant, setting most of it on fire, including many of its chemical.
The bow hit a plant?
Landed, crushed a number of people, and lit it on fire. The propeller landed near the docks at the foot of a housewife named Olga Sawyer, who was very lucky to survive.
Yeah.
The anchor went completely airborne and fell 2 miles away, creating a 10-foot crater on the Pan American oil refinery grounds.
Damn.
A 1.5-ton drill stem is tossed 15,000 feet. Warehouse O completely vanishes. The Southwestern Sugar and Molasses Factory is incinerated, sending molasses flooding through the city.
No, more molasses.
More molasses.
Oh.
This explosion set off a chain reaction. As debris fell through the city, they hit oil tanks that exploded and caught on fire. The blast cracked multiple pipes that were under the ground that sent flaming oil shooting in just random sections in the middle of streets.
It's so bad.
They were 15 to 20 feet high, just from street level, those breaks in the pipes that were sending oil up in the air. 4,000 feet away, huge balls of fire the size of hot air balloons are coming out of the Sid Richardson Refining Company's oil tanks. A 3,000-pound, 30-foot-long oil well pipe flew 2 miles and landed in another oil storage tank owned by Amoco and set it on fire.
God. It's a cluster bomb.
Oh, it's absolutely horrific. I mean, it's not good. So we've got oil tanks exploding all over the city, sending huge walls of flames up in the air. There was more than 20 that just exploded in this first explosion. The explosion also caused a 20-foot tidal wave of scalding water to go 150 feet into the town, with the barge Longhorn riding the top of this tidal wave. The water itself is filled with diesel fuel, hydrochloric acid, ammonium nitrate, styrene, just all kinds of disgusting stuff. So it's not good water. The ship lands on top of the city's one and only fire truck. The wave hits... The wave hits Frank's Cafe and sweeps patrons completely out of there and back into the water. It feels very similar to the molasses flood, except there's also a whole ass explosion.
Yeah.
They tried to say the molasses flood was an explosion. This is really an explosion. It also sent a concussive shock wave, like we talked about when ammonium nitrate explodes.
Mm-hmm.
So just a huge shock wave that went flying through the city and also created a vacuum that suffocated a couple of people.
Oh, lovely.
The explosion formed a mushroom cloud above Texas City. Any planes that were flying in the area, their wings were sheared off and they dropped from the sky.
It's just taken all comers.
It's biblical.
Fuck.
The barrio and the bottom are essentially gone. 32 sailors from the Grand Camp are never seen again. All 27 firefighters that were fighting the fire right there, gone. Most of them were not identified. The concussive blast and the explosion was so strong that clothing was completely blown off people. Body parts were blown off of people.
Yeah.
Debris cut people in half. I mean, the injuries were horrific, and not just from the fires, though the fires were horrific as well. People are so coated with molasses, oil, and other materials that their race can't be determined, again, like the molasses episode, which is really, really great in an incredibly racist town. The hospitals, when they start getting filled up nearby, had a number of questions on why their colored wards were so full, and there was almost no one in the white wards. They were not nearly as good as wiping people off. Yeah. Again, this is an incredibly racist town, and that plays into it. Like, they just make a gut reaction. It's awful. There was one car whose window, this is a survivor reported this, they saw a car whose windows were melted out, but with no other visible damage. However, the folks inside the car had been decapitated.
Jesus Christ.
You might want to brace yourself for this next one.
This is like some
Are you braced?
Supernatural.
It is very supernatural. Shit. One child witness reported running away from the elementary school and trying to hold the hand of a woman who was fleeing as well when the woman's legs started to wobble. When the child looked up, he realized that she had been beheaded but was still running.
Fuck!
This was awful and just absolutely biblical. Folks were fleeing the devastation any way they could, on foot, in cars, completely overloading things as much as possible, trying to get the hell out. We're talking people holding onto the hoods of cars, onto the roofs of cars, onto the fenders of cars, just taking off as fast as they can and in any way they can getting out of town.
Do not blame them.
No, people were also having to press wet rags and masks over their faces because there was so many chemicals in the air. It was making it very difficult to breathe because chemistry revolution, tons of chemical plants, and it was all in the air at this point.
It's all on fire.
And it's all on fire. We've got chemicals in the air and fires. It's not good. At the time, Curtis Trahorn was the mayor. When the explosion happened, he had just dropped his oldest son and the neighbor kid off at school. His youngest kid was home with the chicken pox. Curtis hadn't made it that far from the school when the explosion happened. His car was okay, so he immediately headed back towards the school to try and find his oldest child. As he's kind of driving around trying to figure out what the hell happened, he sees this kid, Forrest Walker, he's a high school kid who works for Curtis, holding his son's hand, just kind of walking shell-shocked down the street. So Curtis goes, he gets his kid, he tells Forrest, do you need anything? And Forrest says he doesn't know where his family is. So he sends Forrest off to go find his family, takes the oldest kid home, feeling very grateful that he found his son.
Right.
Drops him off and manages to make it back to City Hall by 9:40. The explosion happened at 9:12.
Okay.
Able to do all of that.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Is in just
remarkable.
a little under 30 minutes. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And things were moving very quickly. So by 9:40, he's back at City Hall. His son's home, and he's starting to try and take care of business as best as possible. City Hall itself was pretty darn damaged. About half of it had kind of fallen over. The rest of it was still standing. So he's working out of a bombed out building on top of everything else. People don't really know what to do, so they're bringing the dead and injured to City Hall. because that, I guess, seems like a central place. There were no
Damn.
hospitals in Texas City. There was some clinics, but no actual hospitals. So
Why no hospitals?
because of its location, it was located right between Galveston and Houston, and it was kind of like a small suburb of both of those cities.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the way the geography is, you have to take a bridge to get to either one of those places and where the hospitals were. So it does make sense why there weren't hospitals, but also it wasn't that easy to get to the hospitals, especially with everyone escaping at this point. One of the first things that Curtis did was call up all of those hospitals and let them know he's sending the injured there. They start commandeering school buses, bread trucks, and sending people over to the local hospitals as fast as they can. They're also working on trying to corral looters, trying to corral the wandering elementary students because the elementary school had basically collapsed.
No.
There was just a ton of tiny kids wandering, trying to figure out what to do because it was just pretty awful. They're also trying to collect the dead, trying to identify them. At this time, the telephone operators were on strike. And in the 1940s, in order to make a call, you had to go through the telephone operator.
Yep.
So there were still telephone operators. Only essential calls could go through. But there were a lot of essential calls that needed to happen. So he shoved a bunch of telephone workers back to work. Yeah. I don't think he did it unkindly. I think it was more along the lines of like, dear God,
we need you.
Do this now. One really fucked up story that stuck with me, Joseph Vasquez was one of the people who was put on a bus and sent to a Galveston City hospital. He was a Mexican longshoreman, so he worked at the docks. When he got to the hospital, he was put in the hallway on a cot because they didn't have a lot of buildings. And shortly after he was laying there, a doctor walked by and looked at him and goes, "Is he a doggo? Take him to room 223, the morgue. He's going to die soon." This man was not dead. He was still alive. But the doctor was like, "Oh, he's a Mexican? Go ahead and just send him to the morgue. He's going to die soon."
What an asshole.
So they wheel him in, they cover him with a sheet and leave him there in the morgue. A couple of hours later, cleaning lady...
They covered this live man in a sheet.
They put him in a sheet like he was a dead body.
Just to prep for it.
A couple of hours later, a cleaning lady comes through the morgue to do what she does. And from underneath the sheet, he asks her if he can have a glass of water. He probably took 10 years off of that woman's life. Can you imagine going into the morgue and suddenly from under the sheets, there's like, "Can I have some water, please?"
Oh my God. So
she goes and she tells the doctor, like, "Dude, what do I do here? Do I give the dead man water? Do we take the dead man out? Like, what's the plan here, doc?" And the doc tells her to give him all the water he wants. He's going to die anyway.
Again, massive dick.
Vasquez lay under that sheet in the morgue for 7 hours before the doctors finally realized he's not going to just die and moved him out into the regular hospital ward. Bananas. So that one stuck with me because that one's just messed up.
That is messed up.
1,784 people are admitted to the 21 hospitals in the surrounding area of Texas City. Whew. By 10 o'clock in the morning, so less than an hour after the disaster, the hospitals were filled with the sound of pinging as glass was pulled out of people's bodies.
Oh.
There are people that were shedding glass out of their skin for decades after this disaster because so many people were just so embedded with little pieces of glass from everything just exploding. Because all of the windows in the entire town blew out at the same time.
So years later, they're still picking this crap out of their skin?
It's like falling out. It would surface and
work
come out.
Oh.
Yeah, for decades after this.
That's awful.
By chance, the Red Cross chapter in Galveston City had received 210 surgical dressings that morning. Okay. And within 30 minutes, they poured into the city with this and a lot of other medical equipment because they were in the middle of a meeting. So there was a ton of nurses and doctors from the Red Cross in Galveston, which is right over a bridge. So they came over very quickly and were helping very quickly. Within a few hours, Curtis Trahan, the mayor, had a ton of help from all over, not just the Red Cross. The feds immediately offered to send whatever aid they could. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sent the 4th Army. He was still general at that point. He sent the 4th Army platoon along with 31 planes and a convoy of trucks, ambulances, and mobile mess kitchens. By all accounts, the Army did not take over the way it sometimes happens. They listened to the locals and really were extraordinarily helpful during this phase of disaster.
Awesome.
They were very, very good. The 8th Naval District also sent aid along with a hospital ship to hang out in the harbor. So they had a hospital by Thursday. When the army arrived, they really did spread out over the whole city, but also over the water, because there was a number of mysterious skiffs that showed up, and there were people going through the pockets of floating bodies. And the army went out and stopped that. Isn't that awful?
That is awful.
Really awful. McGarr Station was at 618 Fifth Avenue North in Texas City. They offered to be a temporary morgue. They were less damaged than a lot of other buildings in Texas City.
Okay.
So they started telling people, they cleared off the garage floor and told people to bring bodies there. They would start rinsing them off, start trying to identify them, do whatever they could. It kind of became the de facto place for people to bring bodies.
Okay.
Because they were clearing out City Hall as much as possible. This was pretty close.
And City Hall was half fallen down anyway.
That too. And so at 5:30 p.m. on April 16th, Curtis made it official. That was going to be the temporary morgue. And he also formally created a commission called the Dead Body Commission. And their whole job was to collect and then identify the bodies and then take them to McGarr's station. A lot of times they were not identified until they got to McGarr's station, because there's only so much you can do. There were everything from bread trucks to army vehicles loaded with bodies and body parts going through the city to McGarr's. And most of the volunteers at McGarr's who were cleaning off these bodies and taking personal effects and tagging them were locals. So friends and neighbors of the people who had died.
Wow. Are all these oil pipes and stuff still burning at this point?
They're still burning. It takes a couple of weeks for all the fires to go out. But the Grand Camp was not the only ship in the harbor at that point.
No.
It was not the only cargo ship in the harbor at that point. There were 3 ships on the morning of April 16th. There was the Grand Camp, there was the High Flyer, and there was the Wilson B. Keene. The High Flyer was a 438-foot vessel, and it had 961 tons of ammonium nitrate in its holds. That ammonium nitrate was stored next to a large load of very flammable and explodable sulfur.
Jesus.
High Flyer Captain Mosley Petterman called an emergency alarm, putting crew on their fire battle stations when he saw the Grand Camp start to smoke.
Okay.
He had them ready to go. The High Flyer and Wilson B. Keene were only about 600 feet or so from the Grand Camp in their berths. When that first explosion happened, the High Flyer was ripped entirely from her moorings and sent slamming into the side of the Wilson B. Keene, crumbling most of her port side and blowing open many of the hatches.
Yeah.
Not great. She's not doing well. She also catches fire
Like you do.
very quickly. By 10 o'clock, Petterman had been trying to put out the fires for about 45 minutes while the entire town is also on fire and going insane. And he realizes that they're not going to be able to do that. So he tries to get them to pull the anchor so that they can try and get the ship out of those waters. But the anchor's chain was messed up somehow, and they weren't able to pull the anchor up onto the ship. So the anchor's off. It's stuck. The ship's on fire. They're crushed into the side of the Wilson B. Keene. And there's no fire crew in the city anymore because it just got blown up.
Yep.
There's no one really paying attention to this because
with the others.
Everything's on fire.
Chaos.
At 10 o'clock, when he orders his crew off, they were so crunched in that they had to actually climb over the fire and then onto the Wilson B. Keene to get off of the ship.
Ooh.
And they did. They all made it off. To make things even more just complicated, the ship's on fire. They tried to tell some people, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the FBI shows up and starts...
The FBI?
They were worried that it was a communist terroristic plot.
Of course they were.
So the FBI is pulling aside any dock worker it can find in particular, and any sailor it can find in particular. Dock workers and sailors are often people from out of town, and many of them are not native-born American citizens. So they're kind of the first suspects. Not that they should be,
right?
But they were the first suspects. So it takes until 7:30 in the evening for news to finally reach the mayor that there's another ship on fire that has ammonium nitrate in its holds.
Okay.
By 8 o'clock, he's doing whatever he can to try and figure this out. They've contacted tugboats in Galveston again and asked if they can get the high flyer pulled out into open water because there's just not enough fire crews to do much at this point.
Right.
Maybe we can pull it out into the water. The Bay Towing Company asks for volunteers, and enough people volunteered to have 4 separate crews, so 4 separate tugboats make their way out to this ship. By the time they arrive, there's neon red sparks firing from the ship's hold. The dock is not visible through the smoke, and there's burning debris and bodies littering the water all around it. They initially try and tow her out, but it doesn't work. They climb onto the ship to try and cut the anchor off and are unable to do it and ultimately abandon the ship because there's not much they can do. While they're doing this, news reports start coming out that there's going to be another explosion. On top of that, all of this army that's there starts going through the streets with megaphones telling people to get out of downtown Texas City because there's going to be another explosion. So they were able to evacuate people that weren't, dead or in pieces in the bottom part of Texas City. At 1:10 a.m. in the morning, a 3,000-foot tower of flame shoots into the night sky.
3,000 feet.
The explosion was even larger than the SS Grand Camp. Thankfully, there were only 2 deaths since the city had been evacuated. One of them was one of the dead body commissions, a student mortuary worker, and another one was an unidentified, we're assuming, dock worker who was cut in half by debris.
Whew.
So, everything's on fire.
Twice.
It's not going well. Yeah, there's 2 explosions. Thankfully, while the second one was bigger, it didn't cause nearly as much death, but it did destroy pretty much anything that was near the waterfront that had survived the first one.
Oh, yeah.
It was demolished. By Thursday morning, they had gotten pretty much all of the wounded out of the area, and they had moved into recovery and identification efforts. There are still blazes all over the waterfront. There is no running water. There is no electricity.
Yeah, it's all gone.
They're trying to pull up water from these reservoirs, but they're running out of the reservoir water as well to put out fires because there's just not a lot there. And they start trying to use the bay water, which thankfully doesn't cause any more big problems. But it was a calculated risk that they had to take at that point. It took a couple of weeks to completely put out all of the fires. There are hundreds of bodies, both whole and partial, moving their way through Megars.
Wow.
When they get to Megars, they get cleaned off, their personal belongings are tagged and collected, and once everything is kind of cleaned up, the bodies get moved to the high school gymnasium floor if they're not identified already. They have to move through. They don't have enough space to keep everyone in Megars. Exactly. They have to keep it moving. In the gym, these bodies are laid down in rows covered by brown army blankets with tag numbers that correlate to a list of descriptions of the bodies to help guide families to where they might want to go. Okay. Like if they had, their husband was missing. Yeah. They could say he's a black man who had a pocket watch, and they could look at the list and guide them to the right person, hopefully. There were chalkboards that were salvaged from the elementary school out front that had the list of all the named deads already with their number so that families could visit those bodies if they had already been identified. Inside the gym, families that were trying to identify their loved ones had to use candles or flashlights.
Because there's no electricity.
And they did have emergency lights, but there was also so much smoke that even with the emergency lights, it was very hard to see. There was still intermittent explosions as oil drums would go off.
Oh, man.
Or cars backfiring. And every time there was a loud noise, everyone in the gymnasium would hit the floor, cover themselves amongst all the bodies.
That's not psychologically scarring at all.
Not even a little bit. There were 385 bodies total that were processed through Megars in the high school gym. So I wanted to talk about just a few individual stories. That I thought were both interesting and they're important to the rest of the narrative. The first one were Henry and Elizabeth Dalehite. These 2 were apparently just the gems of the town. Everybody loved them. They were the kind of house where you could go over and you wouldn't just get fed. You would get fed like 10 meals in one because Elizabeth would never take no for an answer. Henry was a very experienced seaman. His job was to guide ships into and out of the harbor. He knew these waters. Yep, he knew these waters like the back of his hand. And because of his job, he knew most of the sailors and most of the people who worked in that shipping industry because without him, they
Yeah.
couldn't get there. They couldn't do it. So Henry was supposed to be guiding a boat the next day, that Thursday, April 17th. Because of the phone workers' strike, he wasn't able to call in to ask when he needed to be in the next day. Many of these dock workers had to call or get called to know when their hours were, because when ships came in would vary. It depended on if they caught bad weather, if they were ahead of schedule. Like, it wasn't always the same.
Yeah, it can't be a regularly scheduled thing.
And he didn't know when he was supposed to be there. They started trying to call the office at like 2:30 in the morning, trying to convince the phone operator that it was essential. And they were denied by the phone operator, so they went into town to figure out when he needed to be at work the next morning. Elizabeth drove him in. They arrived at the docks at 9:10, so 2 minutes before the explosion.
Oh, man.
Henry tried to get Elizabeth to come in with him, and she told him no, she wanted to say her morning prayers, and got out her little Mother of Mary statue, while Henry got out to walk in to find out when he needed to be at work the next day. When the wall of fire arrived, Elizabeth saw Henry for half a second before he disappeared into the flames. The car windows of the car she was in completely exploded, pelting her and shoving glass inside of her, and the head of her Mary statue was blown clean off. She gets out of the car, tries to find Henry.
Oh, she survived.
She survives. She tried to find Henry for just a few moments right after the explosion, until she realized that there was a ton of injured people near her, and they started asking her for help. So she loaded as many of them as she could into her car and drove them to City Hall before returning to try and find Henry. And she went through a lot before finally going home. The next day, she tried to go to the gym to find Henry. She went 3 different times and couldn't find him. It wasn't until late that afternoon that her friend Clark Thompson called and said that he found Henry's body in the newest load that had come through. And Henry had died the same way her statue had fallen apart. His head he was beheaded. And it was just...
There's a lot of beheadings in this one.
There's a lot of beheadings
for
in
an
this
explosion.
one. Explosions have a lot of beheadings. Like, that's
Clearly.
actually pretty normal. Forrest Walker, the high school student who worked for Curtis, who found his son.
Yeah.
After he returned Curtis's boy to him, he went looking for his family. His father was a boilermaker at the Monsanto factory that was right next to Pier O. That's the one that some part of the ship landed on and lit it on fire.
Oof.
He eventually finds his mother in their destroyed house, and she was so shell-shocked and just not doing well that he decides to get his mom out of town. They hop into their car, and they grab a couple of stragglers, head out of town to Houston.
Book it.
They ended up getting lodging with a stranger. Somebody offered them their home to stay in. They came back on Thursday, the next day. And this one it hit me hard. They went looking for his father, and they had a couple of tries as well. And it wasn't until Forrest found his father's pocket watch in the pile of personal belongings that they knew his dad was there. The number was 244. So when they went to go find the body, what they found was a 3-foot by 2-foot little wrapped package. That was all that was left of his father.
God.
Sorry. One more.
Ooh.
Julio Luna was a World War II veteran and a longshoreman who worked at the docks. His ship in World War II was actually sunk by a Japanese torpedo. He sailed on the USS Star King. So he had already been through a pretty explosive event in his life. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. He was one of the folks who was loading the ammonium nitrate and putting out those little fires that we talked about. He also tried to go back into hold number 5, which is where the small arms ammunition was. And he wasn't able to remove the ammunition. Like, he tried, but things just went bad too quick. But he did try. At 9:12, he was driving away from the dock with a few other dock hands. So they were on their way home because they had been taken off the ship and they thought the firefighters had it. His car ends up driving through fire and completely spitting out before almost flipping. Despite that, him and all of the dock workers that were in that car survived, got out, and went immediately back to the docks to start helping. And they ended up saving a number of people through their actions.
Good.
I'm ending on a good note. I gave you some horrific ones here. The last body was removed from under debris 26 days after the Grand Camp exploded.
Ooh.
26 days.
26 days.
It and all of the other unidentified bodies are taken to Camp Wallace, and they are left in the mess refrigerators.
No.
Yep. They didn't have a lot of choice.
No, yeah.
They really
did. My initial reaction was like, what the fuck? But
And the army was
they
willing
didn't
to help as
have
much as
anything-
possible, so they offered up that too. I think that's actually, of all the things in this story,
It makes sense when you stop and think about it for just a moment.
I'll never have dinner at Camp Wallace, though.
You'd hope they weren't using the same refrigerators.
I won't eat there. That's a no. Hard no. There were 405 identified dead, 113 known missing, and 63 unidentified. The official death toll reflects that at 581 deaths, but it is assuredly too low. There are more people than that died. They're just not recorded. There had been no accurate census of the bottom or the barrio, basically ever.
Yeah.
So they
that's what I
didn't
was
know
just
how many
thinking.
people lived there. They didn't know how many people were on the dock. There was a number of people who weren't even U.S. citizens that were in the area because this is a port town.
Yep.
There's a number of undocumented people living and working in that area. Like, there was just no way to count everyone. And there's no way that it was only 581. And we'll never know the true total. We just know it's definitely more than 581. All of the death certificates and medical records were sealed, so there's no accurate account on like how many men or women or whatever died. But the Red Cross did say that 23 of the recorded dead were children under the age of 6. The first burials began on April 24th, 1947. The very first day, there were 38 people being buried, and the funeral processions were 8 miles long all the way through the city. Nearly every daylight hour for the next 10 days had at least one burial service in the city's cemeteries.
It's a lot of people to bury.
This was also the time when the first mixed-race religious service in Texas City happened. There was a memorial service for the victims, and it's the first time that Blacks, whites, and Mexicans all celebrated a religious service at the same time. Finding a burial site for the unidentified was incredibly difficult. There was really no more space inside of Texas City, so they were trying to figure out what to do. Curtis assigned his friend Dormius the job of figuring this out. He went around trying to find, an acre or two to buy that they could bury these people on. But there was a few places that he found good land that refused to sell it to him because they were planning on burying both black and white people on the land.
Oh, come on.
Horrific. Racism is a big part of this story. It's Texas in the 1940s.
Yeah.
It's an important thing to remember. Eventually, though, they did find a 2-acre plot of land just north of the city. And for the first time in Texas, blacks and whites were buried in the same cemetery. Not only that, it's very possible, in fact, very likely, that a couple of the graves were both black and white people on the same grave because they were just body parts that were covered in molasses and oil and not good things. The ceremony itself, I thought, was really interesting. It was led by a number of different ministers, an Episcopalian, a Methodist, a white Baptist, a black Baptist, a Jew, and a Catholic. They didn't know what religion.
They didn't know what religion these people were. You got to try and hit.
But how cool that they came together and did it together.
No, that is really cool, especially
like
for the
that.
time.
Especially for the time. For a mixed race burial, we've got mixed race religious leaders leading it. That's cool. The unidentified weren't buried until June 22nd, 1947, because of how much trouble they had finding land to bury them on.
Oh, man.
Their graves are marked with the same numbers that they were marked with in the mortuary, ranging from 142 to 404 in random order. That's all that's on their gravestones is those numbers.
Wow.
Some of the help that poured into the city, and there wasn't much, was from mobsters, which I thought was pretty interesting. Huh. There was a chapter of the mob in Galveston, one mob boss in particular, who was apparently super good friends with Frank Sinatra. So they put on this memorial concert headed by Frank Sinatra to donate
I don't know
money.
why this is funny.
It is funny.
It's random. That's why
they got more money from mobsters than they did from the federal government. So it's worth mentioning.
Wow.
A lot of money also poured into the town from insurance agencies. Not to the people.
Of course not to the people.
To the businesses. Monsanto filed with their insurance company and ended up receiving the largest payout ever in U.S. history up until that point at $100 million. And they decided to rebuild their plant in almost exactly the same location it was before it completely blew up.
Corporate assholes.
Monsanto was one of the only companies, though, that did something for its employees. They gave every victim's family $1,000 each, which is not a lot, but it was not from any kind of like liability. They weren't told to by a judge. They just did it. I don't think that's enough, but none of this was Monsanto's fault.
It's a small thing.
It's fucked up that Monsanto got more money from insurance than people there.
Yeah.
But this was not Monsanto's fault. We can say a lot about Monsanto, but in this case, it wasn't their fault.
Mm-hmm.
Disease also reared its head really quickly after the disaster. With so much devastation, all of it still on fire, getting everyone's body was no easy task. And with bodies that are not being collected quickly, decomposition starts to happen. It's
Disease.
Texas. Mosquitoes start to happen.
Ooh.
Bugs start to happen. Disease starts to happen. And this is the era of the chemistry revolution. In fact, DDT had just been really put out on the market. The federal government decided that one of the best ways they can help prevent disease was to spray the entire city with DDT.
No!
Multiple times in enormous amounts over the course of that summer.
While there's people still there.
Still there. Texas City eventually did earn the nickname Toxic City because of the number of cancers and birth defects that were happening in the years after this.
Oh, it's awful.
Super fun. This disaster fell out of people's minds pretty quickly. They kind of just forgot about it. And I think a lot of that has to do with just how insane April of 1947 in the United States was. 8 men were killed in a mine explosion in Indiana. 18 people were killed when a firework factory exploded in Missouri. 16 were injured when a train derailed in New Mexico. Another mine explosion in Pennsylvania killed 9. 40 were injured in a train wreck in Indiana. 11 homes were destroyed in a Maryland fire. There was a Texas-Oklahoma tornado that killed 185. 2,398 homes were destroyed in Michigan floods. 475 homes were destroyed in Pennsylvania flooding. And I'm not even naming all of the shit that went wrong in April 1947.
God. That was another year where someone was fucking playing Jumanji again, they needed to just put the board game away.
It has real 2020 vibes. It really does. As annoyed and frustrated and sad as I get when people forget about disasters, I can kind of get why this one was just one of many that year for the general population.
When there's just so much going on, you just can't.
You can't hold it in anymore.
No.
2 weeks after the disaster, Curtis Trahan goes to D.C. to appear before the House Appropriations Committee to ask for $15 million to be allocated to Texas City to help rebuild and help the residents. So people are starting to forget 2 weeks later. No one cares a ton about what's going on here. So shockingly,
of course,
he's completely denied. Congress thought that sending a big check would be tantamount to admitting fault, especially since the government was the one shipping most of that ammonium nitrate.
We can't appear like we might be at fault, so suffer.
And just to illustrate how much no one learned shit, July 28th, 1947, a ship that sailed from Baltimore to Brest, France, exploded in the harbor, killing 20 and injuring 500.
Awesome.
Some places started to make ships that were loaded with ammonium nitrate leave the harbor immediately, but not everyone. There was still no warning labels. It was still not openly out there. Nothing changed. Nothing changed. Nothing changed. In 1947, a few months before this disaster happened, Congress passed this really, really sweeping bill. One of the things in this bill is something called the Federal Tort Claims Act. What this did is it said that the U.S. government could be held accountable and sued by private citizens. Up until that point, you were not allowed to sue the government no matter what. But that tort law opened up the door to be able to sue the government. And there is a scrappy lawyer named Russell Markwell who thought this disaster would be the perfect thing to try and test that new legislation. So he gathered up all 424 suits that had already been brought up against the United States by 8,485 people living in and around the Texas city. So basically everyone else who's left alive, and made the first class action lawsuit against the United States.
Oh, cool.
This lawsuit is Civil Action 787. It's Dale Height versus the United States of America. They chose Elizabeth Dalehite as the face of this lawsuit. This is something that happens in class action lawsuits. They're usually one person who's like the main person and represents everyone else. It doesn't mean that they get more money or they're the only one suing, but it makes it easier to understand everything, and that tends to be where the focus is. So it was Dalehite versus the United States government. This lawsuit had tons of ramifications. If the government was found liable, it could open the door to things like African Americans suing for slavery. It could open the door for Native Americans suing for their native rights, for the reservations that they were put on. I mean, we can list 10,000 things that both African Americans and Native Americans could sue for. It could also open the government to being sued by soldiers for trauma that they received in war, or families of soldiers suing for their family member dying. Like, it's not just good things it can open it up to. There's legitimately bad things. Well, I don't know that's bad, but things that are more frivolous. Frivolous is not the right word. More problematic.
More problematic. When you join the military, you're signing up to...
Yeah, my point is just that's very, very different than slavery.
Absolutely.
And it's not the same kind of thing. And I think suing for slavery makes a lot of sense. Suing for dying in a war doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But that's where we are. In the lawsuit, they said that because the United States didn't mark any of this, didn't warn anyone, they were liable, that they should have protected their citizens. They should have taken steps to make sure this ammonium nitrate was being handled safely. There should be regulations. One of the quotes from that initial lawsuit was, quote, "The defendant sold and shipped large quantities of said chemical compound to Texas City. The defendant should have known that said chemical compound was inherently dangerous and highly explosive."
Yes.
Elizabeth Dalehite ended up being really the absolute perfect person for the face of the case. On the stand, she was incredibly compelling. Not only that, everyone in the area knew her and loved her. One of the quotes that just broke my heart from when she was on the stand, she was being asked how long it was from when Henry left the car to the explosion. And she said, "I couldn't say how long because time meant nothing to me when I was with Henry. I devoted all of my time to my husband."
Oh.
I mean, just heartbreaking. She was really, from everything I read and everything I saw, she was the perfect person to lead this. This first lawsuit was being heard by U.S. Judge Thomas M. Kennerly, who was really known as a hard knock in that area. He had never been to law school. He was just crazy interested in law. He read every law book he could get his hands on. And when he went to the bar and said that he wanted to be a lawyer, they asked him a couple questions, realized how much this dude knew, and let him take the bar exam, and he passed with flying colors, no problem.
That's kind of cool.
He was known to be a letter of the law guy.
Okay.
There was not a lot of wiggle room for Kennerly. He was kind of considered by the survivors to be the worst possible judge they could have gotten because he was so rigid about so many things. And especially since this case was testing new legal waters. This was a brand new law.
No precedent is there.
There's no precedent at all. So it's completely, he's making the precedent, Kennerly, and that was not his strong suit. The trial started in October of 1949. Now, again, Texas City had received no monetary government help at this point. They had denied any help from Congress. They had sent the army. They sent medical supplies. They didn't do nothing. But there was no compensation. Nobody was being helped by the government monetarily. During the trial, General Hughes, who was in charge of the Army Ordnance Network, he was the one who kind of oversaw all of the production and shipment of ammonium nitrate, said, quote, "I think the conclusion to which I have come is that ammonium nitrate has always been regarded as dangerous. There have always been restrictions on the handling of ammonium nitrate, the shipping of ammonium nitrate." Does that sound like what we talked about?
No.
So when he was asked, did he warn anyone who might handle it? Like let the shippers or the railroads know that it was dangerous? And he said no. He didn't tell anyone. So he knew it was all dangerous. No, he was asked, did you warn anyone? You knew it was dangerous. So did any of you guys tell the railroads? Did any of you tell the shipping companies? And no, we didn't. We knew it was dangerous and we didn't tell anyone.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yep.
Super, super great. So it goes like that. There's a lot of testimony like that. It's obvious the government knew it was dangerous. How could they not? They were using it to blow up everything in Europe and in Asia at that point.
Literally used to make bombs.
Kennerly announces his ruling on April 13th, 1950, and he shocks everyone, and he finds the government liable.
Oh, really?
He had an incredibly blistering opinion about the entire situation. I'm going to quote this too. The record discloses blunders, mistakes, and acts of negligence, both of omission and commission on the part of the defendant, its agents, servants, and employees. It discloses such disregard of and lack of care for the safety of the public and of persons as to shock one. When all of the facts in this record are considered, one is not surprised by the Texas City disaster, that men and women, boys and girls, in and around Texas City, going about their daily tasks in their homes and on the streets, in their places of employment, were suddenly and without warning killed, maimed, and wounded. The surprising thing is that there were not more such disasters.
Damn.
Blistering.
Yeah.
Kennerly was pissed. He ruled that all the families should receive compensation. Just as one example, Elizabeth's family was supposed to receive $75,000 in compensation, $60,000 for Elizabeth as the spouse of Henry, $15,000 for her son.
Okay.
No one saw any money, ever.
How does that not surprise me?
The case was appealed to the U.S. Fifth Court of Appeals. The trial started on December 7th, 1951. The government took a new tactic this time, and they essentially argued that the Federal Tort Claims Act of 1947, the one that allows for citizens to sue the government, that law was not intended for them or for anyone like Texas City. It wasn't for those types of citizens. They argued that international interests and vital foreign policies override everything, that global strategies for the United States are more important than some deaths of its citizens. Fighting Russia and communism was more important than the lives of those in Texas City.
Fucking assholes.
On June 10th, 1952, the Court of Appeals overturned the ruling entirely, saying that the government was not in fact liable. It was a unanimous decision. In their opinion, they talked about how important discretion was, that the government needs to be able to exercise its own discretion while making choices, particularly when it comes to matters of national security. So we need to be able to give Europe fertilizer, and if people in Texas City die for it, it's fine.
Because that's a matter of national security.
Markwell appealed the lower court decisions and brought it to the Supreme Court.
They did the same thing, I'm guessing. Or upheld them.
On June 8th, 1953, the Supreme Court put out a few history-making opinions. One of them was, can restaurants in D.C. refuse to serve Black people? And they found that, no, they can't refuse, and desegregated restaurants in D.C. They also released their ruling on the case of Dale Height versus the United States, and they chose not to overrule the Fifth Court's ruling.
Of course.
They upheld that the government was not liable, again, citing discretion, saying pretty explicitly that no one is arguing that ammonium nitrate isn't dangerous, but the government needs to be able to take calculated risks in the name of foreign policy and not be hamstrung by litigation. So even when deaths occur, in order to function, government needs that discretion to be able to make hard calls. And we can't set the legal precedent because this could freeze, government functions, it could freeze their policies, it could open up elected officials and government employees to endless accusations, blah, blah, blah. It was a 4-3 decision, so it was split basically down the middle. The judges who voted against it were also pretty blistering in their opinion, because they put out their dissent, right?
Oh, yeah.
Justice Jackson wrote the dissenting opinion. He served on the Nuremberg trials. Just to give you a picture of who he was. That was something he did before this. In his dissent, he was also utterly blistering. He said, quote, "This is a day of synthetic living, when, to an ever-increasing extent, our population is dependent upon mass producers for its food and drink, its cures and complexions, its apparel and gadgets. The product must not be tried out on the public, nor must the public be expected to possess the facilities or technical knowledge to learn for itself of inherent but latent dangers." So basically, the world is getting more and more messed up. We can't expect people to just know what is and isn't dangerous anymore, because the world doesn't work like that anymore.
No.
There's things out there that don't look dangerous, but are. And we need to tell people that. We need to make sure they're informed.
Absolutely.
We can't just try it out and see what happens. He also said that this ruling was akin to Nazi Germany, that they had lost their moral center, the moral drive to protect its citizenry. He also said, quote, "The government was liable. If not, the ancient and discredited doctrine that the king can do no wrong has not been uprooted."
Ooh.
Yeah, he was not thrilled. I don't think any of us are at this point.
Well, no. I mean, it was stated by the founding fathers, the government exists to serve the people, not people
Right?
to serve the government.
Not anymore, I guess. By this point, it's 6 years later. Monsanto has rebuilt in basically the same spot. Most of the other factories have rebuilt in functionally the same spots they were. Life insurance policies have been filed, and a few people received kind of meager death benefits. People who dig in their garden, in the yard, anywhere in the town will still occasionally dig up pieces of the Grand Camp that are still littered through the town. For years after the disaster, children learned to avoid playing on the beaches because too many scary things would wash up.
Oh.
Yeah, there were pieces of humans that washed up for years after.
Wow.
Fishermen also avoided the waters around Texas City because of what they pulled up in their nets.
That's...
So that's where they're sitting 6 years later. It's not going well. They haven't gotten any money. They lost their case. Markwell has one last plan. He's going to go to Congress and he's going to harass two congressmen in particular, Clark Thompson and Lyndon Johnson. Do you recognize that name?
Yes.
He wants to try and push them into sponsoring a bill that will send some money to the people of Texas City. It took time, but they did eventually get a bill passed on August 12th, 1955. So 8 years after the disaster. 8 years. The Texas City Claims Bill passed and signed into law by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower absolutely hated the bill, apparently, because he felt like it placed blame on the government, but he signs it anyway.
At least he signed it.
Now, in the original opinion, people were set to get about $60,000 for widowers and $15,000 per child. In this new bill, this new money coming, people were limited to claims of $25,000. That was the max that you could
That's
get.
a huge step down.
It was also limited. The only people who could claim were people who had joined the class action before April 1950, which is pretty early in the process. If victims had received any insurance settlements, whatever they received was deducted from the government money.
Assholes.
So on average, each widow, widower, orphaned, or injured victim received $12,195. That's it.
Good to know the government takes care of its people.
American farmers still use 17 billion pounds each year of nitrate fertilizers. Ammonium nitrate is still big business. And there is no way to make it safer without also seriously affecting its use as a fertilizer.
Do they at least transport it and store it in other than paper bags?
So there were some changes made over the years to kind of help regulate the use and storage of ammonium nitrate. But at this point, oversight is still split between a ton of different departments. So there's still a lot of gaps and loopholes in the storage and safety of ammonium nitrate. In 2013, West Texas, there was a fertilizer plant that caught on fire and ended up lighting 250 tons of ammonium nitrate that were improperly stored in wooden boxes. The explosion leveled or damaged more than 150 buildings, killed 15 people, including 12 firefighters, almost all of them from volunteer fire department.
Of course.
Given the amount of chemicals on hand, by the newer regulations, the West Fertilizer Company was supposed to report its ammonium nitrate stockpile to the Department of Homeland Security, but the Department of Homeland Security never heard about it. They didn't know, so the company never told them. A state agency, though, did know about how much they had, so the company kind of thought they had done the right thing, because the state agency should have been the ones to tell Homeland Security. And there's some gray area there because, again, the rules and regulations for ammonium nitrate are complicated. And not that ignorance of the law is any reason not to follow it, but it is complicated and it doesn't apply across the board. And that jumble of like state and federal agencies really causes a lot of problems. And it's a lot of what experts warn about now, that like we need to kind of streamline this. We need to not have it be so complicated.
It should be simple.
It should. On just the federal side alone, the Department of Homeland Security, the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, so the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation, as well as the Departments of Transportation and Agriculture, all have some piece of ammonium nitrate oversight. They all have different laws, different rules. OSHA and EPA, their regulations haven't been updated in 50 years. This is as of 2024. It's been 50 years since they've updated any of their regulations.
I think it's about time to do a review of that.
At the time, and still now, there's something called a retail exemption for OSHA. And what that means is certain companies storing ammonium nitrate are storing it as a retail product, so they don't have to follow the same OSHA rules as the government does. And they can get away with storing it like really improperly and unsafely and all that other kind of stuff because it's a retail product, not a government-made product.
Still dangerous.
It is. OSHA tried to close that loophole after the 2013 West Texas explosion. The fertilizer industry, a number of companies sued them because they're allowed to sue the government, saying that OSHA wasn't following proper rules-making procedure. And the federal court agreed with industry and wouldn't allow OSHA.
Rules-making procedure.
Yeah, they were saying that they couldn't close that retail exemption, that they had to do it in a different way. And the federal court agreed and wouldn't let OSHA close the retail exemption.
Wow.
This means that people are allowed to store ammonium nitrate in wooden buildings without sprinklers. They're allowed to store them in those paper bags. They're allowed to store them in wooden boxes. There's not a lot they're not allowed to do if they have a retail exemption.
Wow.
The companies themselves say that they've created an industry-led oversight and inspection program. Sorry, I'm laughing. I shouldn't laugh. Called Responsible AG, and they voluntarily bolstered their own standards and protocols for ammonium nitrate storage. It doesn't work that well. They're not doing a super great job. After the West Texas explosion, the Chemical Safety Board put out 19 safety recommendations. 12 of them are still unimplemented as of 2024.
Of course.
In August of 2020, this started to come up again, and there was a lot of hope from experts that there would be some changes.
Yeah.
In August of 2020, because that year just went crazy. Do you remember the Beirut explosion?
So much happened in 2020.
I know, I told you about this while it was happening, but
vaguely.
There was a large amount of ammonium nitrate that was stored at the port of Beirut in the capital city of Lebanon. It exploded. It caused 218 deaths, 7,000 injuries, and $15 billion in property damage, along with leaving 300,000 people homeless. It was a huge explosion. There was a cargo of around 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that had been stored in a warehouse without proper safety measures for 6 years. It had been confiscated by the Lebanese authorities and just kind of forgotten about and left in this building unsafely.
Oh my God.
This brought up, again, attempts to change the regulations more, but nothing ever really came of it. Because I think 2020, like nothing went right that year. But it still hasn't changed. So, enjoy going to the docks next time you go down. That's my story. That's where it ends. There's no redeeming happiness at the end of this one. You doing okay? Did I break you this time?
The government shielding itself, letting its citizens just...
I'm going to need to pick one where people actually get some kind of compensation after this, because this is 2 in a row where I'm just like, yeah, so everyone was fucked and nothing good happened.
Well, and it's amazing, but not surprising that the regulations haven't really improved.
Yeah.
And that we're still just letting it kind of be. And trusting that the industry will self-regulate.
Yep.
Fucking happens.
At least never will.
No.
I really thought this was a good one to do after the Doña Paz, because the Doña Paz, we were talking about how not much really changed in the Philippines. And I feel like a lot of times in first world countries, we look at things like that and we're like, oh, thank God, that's not what it's like here. But it is like that here. Ammonium nitrate keeps blowing shit up and we're not doing anything about it. So I hope y'all sleep well.
Yeah, look up where they store ammonium nitrate and stay the fuck away from it.
It's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. But, it's a really interesting story. And it feels like a Michael Bay movie when you're going through how everything went down. Because first the ship blew up and then literally everything else blew up. And then another ship blew up.
Yeah.
Just when you thought you were good. 3,000-foot wall of flame. Middle of the night.
That's a lot.
And I can just give you story after story of beheadings and people getting cut in half, because I guess that's what we do this now.
The one that sticking in my mind and got me was the kid holding the teacher's hand running out of the school.
And looking up and realizing
that she didn't have a head.
That one was horrific. That one stuck with me. There was quite a few. I read a bunch of different articles and I read a couple of different books, and there was just a lot of really graphic, gruesome decisions. What really stuck with me, though, will always be that poor guy at the hospital who got stuck in the morgue. And also the poor cleaning lady. I know it was worse for him being stuck in the morgue, but I just can't imagine being that cleaning lady, walking in and having one of the bodies on the table ask me for water.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
That made my butthole pucker reading it. I can't imagine what real life was. So, bless you, sister. I hope you're okay.
And you know that poor guy probably felt bad for scaring the piss out of her?
That's the way it sounded when I was reading it. Like, he just very politely, can I please have some water? Okay.
Poor guy.
Poor everyone. So, yep, that's the story. We're at almost 2 hours. Should probably wrap it up.
Damn.
And then edit a lot. It was a good story, though.
It was. That was a great story.
So we are so grateful you all were here. We hope you had a good time. We hope you learned something. We hope that the next time ammonium nitrate comes up in a conversation, you let people know not to be idiots with it.
Yeah.
Don't get it wet. Don't put large portions of it together. Don't store it in wooden boxes.
Or paper bags.
But just so you know, if you garden, your little bag of fertilizer is not going to blow up in your shed. That is not enough ammonium nitrate. You're okay.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Made me feel better.
So we have social media.
We do.
We have X, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have Blue Sky, we have Threads. Feel free to follow us, check out what we're doing, leave us a comment. We would love you forever if you would rate and review the show. That helps us with visibility. We have a tip jar in the show notes and a couple other places if you'd like to help financially support the pod. No pressure, but we will love you forever. We'll love you forever either way. Our email is catastrophichroniclespod@gmail.com. And then our website is www.catastrophe-chronicles.com. And on the website, under the pod blog, I put the little blog entries that has a small summary of the episode, and then links and a list of all the research that I did. So you can dive deeper if you want to.
Stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.